Hello and welcome to the second half of this week's thrilling doubleheader in this Scot Goes Popcast. I'm James Kelly, and joining me for episode 12 of the podcast is William Duguid, who is a stalwart of pro-independence Twitter. He has almost 17,000 followers on his personal account, and I have a sneaking suspicion, judging from the content, that he may be the man behind the Yes Perth City account, which has over 5,000 followers. You might also remember William's very popular blog, To September and Beyond, which he ran at the time of the independence referendum. William, thanks for your time today. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you very much. Busy as ever.
Great. Now, I don't know if you remember, but the one and only time that you and I met in real life was at the launch party for the Common Space website in 2015 at the Glasgow School of Art, or the part of it that hadn't actually burnt to the ground. We even appeared together in a Phantom Power video marking the occasion, but we seem to have come full circle because Common Space, or Source News, as it came to be known, shut down a few weeks ago. So all that early promise and excitement eventually fizzled out. Do you regret the demise of Source News? And do you think that's symptomatic of a more general decline in the pro-independence new media?
Well, Source News, as I understand it, disappeared because it wasn't really part of what Commonweal regarded as its key goals, which were to be a think tank and a producer of policy. However, it is noticeable that of late on the Commonweal website, we're seeing a few articles of the sort that would have appeared in Source and before that Common Space in any case, albeit written by perhaps different people. But we've seen the re-emergence of the voice of Robin McAlpine. We hear a lot from a man for whom my respect is absolutely immense, Dr. Craig DL, the policy guru, who has a lot to say on a lot of topics, and seemingly endless time to also appear in meetings and all sorts of things, and really just to spread the word to folks. So if you like, the media side of Commonweal is holding its end up, albeit not quite in the same guise as it was before. In terms of how the media is now, I mean, this is a sort of interesting one for me to discuss because, of course, I was part of it up to 4 years ago. There's so much out there now that is well ahead of where we were in 2013-14. I'm thinking mainly of the auditory and visual stuff. The bright spots such as the output of Independence Live. I think they've really got their act together in the last few months, as has Broadcasting Scotland, but particularly the improvement in Independence Live with its suite of programmes with folks like John Drummond and Mark McNaught and others. Tremendous shows, good interviewees, and well worth sharing with people so that they hear a wee bit more about what's going on. We've still got, and I think it's as good as it's ever been, the Leslie Riddoch podcast, which I regard as a guaranteed great listen every week. I think there's fantastic chemistry she's got with Pat Joyce, and they're not afraid to call a spade, and for me it's sort of absolutely essential Thursday, Friday listening. And I mentioned just now Craig DL, as well as Commonweal's written output. He does an almost weekly, and he's amassed nearly 90 of these. Nearly 100 of these. He's on number 98 now. And that's the Commonweal Policy podcast. Some of it perhaps might appear on the face of it a bit dry, but with Craig around, you're going to have an interesting conversation. And that, I think, is well worth people listening to. It doesn't just cover dry policy, it covers all sorts of other things. It has just done a piece on the demographics of independence, which you might want to talk about later, because it's one of your areas of expertise. So broadcast-wise, although it is, as ever, so difficult to disseminate it to those who need to hear it, and that remains our perennial problem. On that side of things, I think is burgeoning really very well and can only get better. If only we could put more and more resources and money into it. On the written side, That's an interesting one, and because I've got to be careful what I say here, because I know I have either spoken to or met, even just on the phone spoken to, nearly all of the current bloggers, and I do respect.
We're all at war
them.
with each other. Yeah, I know.
Oh, well, I've seen that. I mean, I don't tend to take part in war. I don't even have extended Twitter conversations.
No.
Even if you follow me and you totally agree with what I've said, if it goes beyond the third exchange, something has gone terribly wrong.
You've got it all right, yeah.
Life is too short. Life is too short. It really is. Yeah. Also, I mean, since I was part of the scene 4 years ago, and I'm not, you may ask this question, I might as well try and answer it early. I'm not ruling out coming back. Okay, the only reason I stopped was because I got involved with the SPF City.
Ah, right.
And I was recruited, sorry, this is anecdote time, off into a tangent. I got recruited by Peter Bell. He came to a Commonweal meeting that I was at one night, and he actually headhunted me for the SPF City organisation, which formed about 2-3 weeks later.
Oh yeah, he's from there, doesn't he?
Oh yeah, yeah. We had frequent beers, and he doesn't shout at me. It's really good, honestly. But you know, I said, yeah, quite happy to be part of the SPF City and all that, as long as it doesn't take up too much of my time.
Oh dear.
And I should never have said that, because you just get sucked in. There's always so much to do. First of all, you've got to set things up for the group. Then you've got to start running meetings, and I tended to be chairing meetings and things like that, and also involved in buses to all under one banner marches.
Oh really? Etc. Oh well, that must.
And eventually that elided into, hey, why don't we have a hub? And then that's a whole nother thing with forming a limited company and basically running and managing.
Company? Oh my gosh.
We're a company limited by guarantee. Very respectable to be a company limited by guarantee. You don't have shareholders. You're not in it for profit. You have members. And in the case of the SPF and Green Hub, our members are people who either contribute financially or contribute by volunteering or contribute ideas or resources. And we regard them all as members, and they're on the members register, and they'll all get invited to the AGM in a couple of weeks. But that too is a lot of work. So that's basically why I don't blog, because you will know, and all the other bloggers certainly know, that it is difficult and it takes time to do it right. So I'm not ruling out coming back, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. I think the scene as it is now, it's lost a bit, and some of that has happened because that's just the way things are. Stuart Campbell, whatever everybody thought of them, did something that nobody else did, and that was to tear down the claims being made by unionists about what was going on. There was a lot more he spoke about that caused ructions, and one doesn't want to go into that particularly, but the actual attack on what unionists were saying and the debunking of things has never properly been replaced. And I think that was a great spur to people when he was doing it, that, you know, there was always going to be an answer. But I think generally it's lost, the whole scene has lost its way a little bit, because the sense of overall unity that was there in 2013, 2014 has largely dissipated. I think that just reflects where we are in the whole indie movement at present, not just the media. So I think there's a lot of different strands going on with the media. People are all at war with each other, and that doesn't look great from the outside, and it doesn't really help us to take things forward. And maybe I think it's important to talk about the things that are going on, and to look inward, because there's a lot of stuff that might need fixed looking inward. But maybe that's not all it should be doing. I think we've reached a point where if we're really going to take things forward, we need to, if we're going to win this thing and get away from the cluster bourg that's Westminster, we've got to start attacking the union, critiquing Westminster and putting down the reasons for getting away from the cluster bourg that we're in. And that's what's missing to me at the moment. I don't know what you think about it, because I mean, you're in the war. What do you reckon?
Well, actually, this comes back to a question I asked Yvonne Ridley the other day, which is...
Listen to that one yet.
Right. Well, it was just... it seems to me there's like this kind of straight division in the Yes movement at the moment. One half thinks we have decided, the Scottish government have been elected and they will hold a referendum, and our job is to go out and win that referendum, and everything else is a distraction. And why are you causing this distraction? And why are you causing this division? And the other half thinks we're not going to have a referendum. The Scottish government have no interest in the referendum. And so unless we campaign against the Scottish government to get a referendum, we are wasting our time. And so this is the kind of like philosophical division. So you're saying we've got to get stuck into the union, but others would say, what is the point of getting stuck into the union when the referendum isn't taking place? It hasn't been called, it's not on the horizon, it keeps being pushed back and back and back. So how would you answer that?
Well, I think I'm not saying we should stop doing the other things. This is the thing. I'm saying that we should start attacking the union in addition to that. Okay, so there's nothing to lose.
Yeah, sure.
I agree with you that it's all going to prove pretty pointless at the end of the day if there's never a referendum, either because the Scottish government doesn't call it, or because Westminster's able to throw it off. That's true. Having said that, I don't think there's ever any harm in debunking where they are, we are, and that's primarily what I used to do. And if I do manage ever to make it back, that is what I think I would like to do again, because that is lacking. And it's just something that people who are undecided can print off and give to their friends saying, look, here's somebody saying something about what's going on. This is why you should get out of this. Any rise in the feeling that we should get out of this is going to add to the pressure on whoever it needs to be to hold either a referendum or the democratic event that will get us out of here. We have no way of knowing what's going to hit us next. There could be another pandemic. We didn't expect that, and that threw things way off track for 18 months. So all I'm saying is, let's add to what's there. I don't really want to critique what's there, because what's there is well written, it's sincerely felt, and it isn't in all cases what I would be writing, but it needs to be said. But it's not all that needs to be said.
Yeah, well, I think, obviously, it's been a bit unfortunate because, like, the two leading blogs, I suppose, are Wings Over Scotland and Craig Murray. And Craig Murray can't write because he's in jail, which is, that's not his fault, but, that's the way it's worked out.
We've been quite unlucky. And with folk like Grouse Peter, who's really, really doing a tremendous job still producing stuff, but, he's not well. And it's like a perfect storm in some ways.
I suspect Wings will be back, though. Frank Sinatra had fewer comebacks than Stuart Campbell. I think he's coming back.
Well, yeah, I hope so. I hope the good Stuart comes back. The evil Stuart, no, thank you. But the good one.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, even before you mentioned that, I was going to mention the Independence Live content. I think that back, I think several years ago, it must have been like 2015. I was whisked away. I was driven away to the wilds of Stirlingshire or Eastern Bartonshire or somewhere, and to a secret mystery location. And there was this like plush television studio in somebody's home in the wilds somewhere. Well, I know whose home it was, but I better not say that in case it's a secret. And so it was explained to me that Independence Live had, when it was founded, there had been a sort of division in it. And sort of there was one group who wanted to go for extremely high production values. And so this was the group that I was being interviewed by that night. And the other group, I suppose, was the one that we became more used to as the years went on, which maybe wasn't so concerned with production values, but just wanted to get as much content out as possible. But it seems like now those two sort of competing imperatives have come together, and the production values have improved markedly. The content is really good, and I was involved in the Scottish election results program program, if you want to call that, or show in May, and the scale of that was really, really ambitious. It was almost like watching the BBC. They had Leslie Riddick, and they were covering results. It was really impressive. So yeah, that was. And also, I haven't really been watching it, but I do notice that there's quite an awful lot of content in the, what's it called, the Through a Scottish Prism YouTube channel.
Yes, that's gone visual, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah,
Roddy and
yeah.
Ian Lawson and Mark Hurst, of course, and others. Yes, that's a very interesting one, because that's a very forthright piece, and a lot of people really love that. And that's, I don't always agree with everything that's in that, but I think it's important that it's said.
Yeah, get as many views out there as possible.
Sure.
So right, let's move on to the SNP-Green deal. Do you see that as a big step forward for independence, or is it to do with other things, or how do you see that?
Well, I suspect it is to do with other things. The first thing to say about the deal is that both parties' members are heavily in favour of it, and it's it's been signposted for a little while, so that's something that's quite important. I would think of it as a coalition in all but name, because if you have these informal arrangements, you don't usually get cabinet ministers out of it. And clearly they're doing something right, because the opposition parties are strongly against it. And we've had the spectacle of the Tories calling the Greens extremist, which is quite a stretch, given that, the Green movement is a mainstream international movement. So to start pulling, unless you think they're all sort of Extinction Rebellion folks, which I very much doubt, then that really is a tremendous stretch. Of course, the BBC bandied it about almost immediately. And Andrew Neil rose aghast from his sunbed in France and got quite exercised about the whole idea of the Greens, as if he'd never heard of them before. And sparks coming off the Brillo pad, or the remains of the Brillo pad on his head. So, I mean, it's not been a good few months for Andrew, really, with GB or God blimey news tanking. But there you go. So the other lot are worried. That's really what I'm reaching for. In real life, I don't know. You could claim that the agreement brings additional legitimacy to a parliamentary vote for a referendum.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's wholly true, in the sense that the unionist side will pour buckets of slime over it no matter what you do. And it certainly won't make Boris, or if Boris turns out to be defenestrated by then Michael Gove or whatever other murder puppet, say anything other than now is not the time, and Yabu hissed you had your chance in 2014, and Alistair Jack chimes in with the comb and tissue paper and all that scenario. That will still happen no matter what they do. But for the SNP, it undoubtedly makes life easier. That's really, I think, why they've done it. It makes the day job more manageable. Their budgets will now get through without all the last minute squabbling and not sureness. The no confidence votes that the opposition were throwing around like confetti.
Yeah, they were a waste of time.
A piece of cake to survive. From the Greens' perspective, it gives them a better chance, you might think, of getting some of their key goals, which may not be independence, but closer to realisation. And as a general thing, you could say that it might give the Scottish government a bit more clout and credibility at COP26, which would otherwise be a festival of union jackery and hypocrisy. And to have Green ministers in the parliament of the nation that's holding it, even if Boris is waving a flag off to the side, I think that does have an effect. So there are some pluses which may or may not be realised. And even if they're just in the lifetime of this parliament. So worth doing from that perspective. Some interesting critiques, obviously, when I was researching, I just find the critiques. And George Kerevan had some interesting ideas about, George Kerevan is a man who maybe isn't permanently gruntled, even if he isn't disgruntled, but, he saw it as a kind of cover, camouflage, he called it, for those members of the SNP and supporters of the SNP who are of a left-wing persuasion and would like that sort of society to, if you like, keep them in the camp and keep them hopeful, when in fact there may be elements within the SNP a bit more rightish who want to court people like Benny Higgins and Charlotte Street Partners and the financiers who really aren't into independence very much, but could live with it if it turned Scotland into a photocopy of the UK as it currently is, without the posh accents and bad
What a
hairstyles.
depressing thought.
Sorry?
I was just saying, what a depressing thought that would be.
Oh, sorry, yes. Depressing people is one of the things I do all day long. All day long.
Yeah, I mean, there has been a surprising amount of criticism on the left of this. Some people who are natural fellow travellers of the Greens have been quite critical of this and saying, well, what is the point of this? They're being offered crumbs. It's a very odd arrangement. You read through the agreement, and it's a cooperation agreement between the Scottish Government and the Scottish Green Party, as if those are two completely separate entities. And it stresses again and again, this is not a coalition agreement. We have no interest in entering a coalition. And then it sort of adds, and as part of this agreement, there will be 2 Green ministers. And you think, well, that sort of completely contradicts the entire thrust of what you've been saying. I don't, why do you think the Greens want to pretend what is clearly a coalition is not a coalition?
Well, it could be speculation time, that in future elections, the fact that they've worked together with the SNP or can demonstrate themselves to have worked together with the SNP might increase the possibility that people will vote SNP-1 Green 2. Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of them did anyway. And a lot of pretty solid SNP folk, at least in these parts, were voting SNP-1 Green 2. But they will maybe hope that they get a bit more credibility on that score for that. I think from an individual perspective, folks like Lorna Slater will see it as a platform to really structure stuff. And I think she has got a considerable amount of talent to bring to the party. I'm sure Patrick Harvey does as well. I really don't want to be bad to Patrick Harvey. I'm sorry, but he just reminds me of a biochemist in a lab from the early 20th century somehow. I don't know.
Okay.
There you go.
One thing that occurred to me, I think Alison Johnston, the presiding officer, I think her reputation is probably going to come through this enhanced, because a lot of people were concerned that because she comes from a Green background, she was elected as a Green MSP, that she might not do what was obviously the right thing to do, which was to strip the Green Party of their questions, which are only really a privilege of the opposition parties. And a lot of people thought she'll look at this and pretend it's a cooperation agreement, not a proper coalition, and she'll use that as an excuse to allow the Greens to have their cake and eat it, to continue having the privilege as an opposition party while being in government. And she hasn't done that. She's done the right thing. So I think her reputation for neutrality and even-handedness will probably be enhanced as a result of this.
Yes, and I think she deserves that to happen, because I think it's difficult for any presiding officer taking over to get into the spirit of things, because you're going from being an MP doing an MSP rather doing the cut and thrust to trying to chair the thing in a way.
Yeah.
And it always takes a little while to get into. And I've heard several people saying, well, Alison Johnson hasn't quite got into it yet. Well, give her time, for God's sake.
Yeah.
And this can only help her. And, good luck to her. And I wouldn't like to look after that rabble, particularly with the standard of opposition we're getting right now from Douglas Ross and his, I was going to say his chicken something outfit, but yes, all that stuff. Honestly, beyond belief this week.
Actually, just as an aside, can you understand the psychology of why the Conservatives thought that Douglas Ross would be a good leader? Because this is something that puzzles me. I mean, maybe there's this sort of cultural difference that people on the right of politics look for different things, but I cannot understand how, because it was like sort of the magic circle. It wasn't like he emerged through an electoral process. It was like a magic circle of senior Tories obviously agreed this man was the Messiah. How could they possibly have reached that conclusion when it just isn't that great?
Well, perhaps, is it something as daft as he's an official in football, therefore he's an authority figure?
Well, he's a linesman, God almighty.
All right, yes, authority figure, that's pushing it. He's he's a flag waver, that sort of thing.
Like the Union Jack.
It's very difficult. It's almost like it's Buggin's turn, because the talent pool is so shallow there. I mean, it's only a matter of time before they're on to Stephen Kerr and Annie Wells.
Oh no!
So, so and as a wrecking ball, as what they see as a wrecking ball, and I can just see his little head, round head, as being a wrecking ball. That's the function he fulfills. That's what they want him to fulfill. And they're being backed by the BBC as much as possible. He's being hidden in the right places and accentuated in the right places. So it's just a game to them. They know they can't get power. So, hey, try and undermine.
Going back to the Greens, there was a story that obviously would be of great concern or great interest to the Greens. Was it last night or the night before? But the Financial Times broke this story, or alleged story, that there's been contingency planning at the MOD and about the possibility of Scottish independence and what to do with Trident. And they've been talking about two possibilities. One is to either move Trident to France or the United States. Concerns about the sovereignty of our glorious independent nuclear deterrent if it went to France or the United States. I don't know what difference it would make if it went to the United States, given that some people say that we can't use Trident without the Americans' acquiescence anyway.
The idea is an independent nuclear deterrent is, as much for the birds as saying, oh, don't worry, we'll look after Afghanistan after the US is out, no problem. No, it's never an independent. I heard something weird about maybe it going to Wales. Is that something you heard?
Yeah, well, yeah, they used to talk years ago. I think the Welsh First Minister actually said we actively want this. The Labour First Minister of Wales said we want it in Milford Haven in Pembrokeshire. There's also been talk about Devonport, but obviously there must be some feeling that it's not that those locations are not suitable if they're seriously talking about taking it to France or America. But the other option, much more controversial option, is to annex the area around Helensburgh and keep it as UK sovereign territory after Scottish independence. So
that really shouldn't be a goer in any sensible world. It really shouldn't. And can you imagine if we voted for independence and then in negotiations they gave away Helensburgh? Cracking.
We can't possibly lose Helensburgh, because how would iScot be produced?
I forgot to mention iScot when we were talking about the media. Sorry, I didn't mean that. It's great.
Yes. So, I mean, this is another sort of fault line, I suppose, in the independence movement, because some people, like Stuart Campbell, would say the idea of Helensburgh, or maybe not Helensburgh, but the area immediately around Faz Lane, the idea of using that as a bargaining chip in the negotiations for independence. Of course you want to do that, he would say, because you would solve all these other problems. You would solve, all the obstinacy on the UK side in relation to currency and all the rest of it. You get a fantastic deal just by saying, okay, you can have, say, a 50-year lease on Faz Lane, and it sort of becomes like a kind of Scottish Guantanamo. But of course, I think the vast majority, although Stuart Campbell has a huge following, I think the vast majority of independent supporters would say we actually are serious about this. And it doesn't matter what the cost is, we have to get Trident off these shores.
Yeah, it's a fundamental moral as well as practical issue. The consensus is it really has to go. And, you would negotiate all that and get such disapproval from the people of your newly created or newly recreated nation. No. The 50-year lease, I can, Stuart does like to propose these slightly controversial things that do make sense in some ways, but no, I mean, in the real world, it wouldn't last 5 minutes. People would disapprove just so strongly.
I mean, I think one thing that's changed the dynamic of this is the nuclear ban treaty, the ban on nuclear weapons. I mean, it's only part, only covers, I think it's like 55 countries or something like that. Well, not exactly 55, but in that region, who have fully ratified it. But now that treaty exists, with the tradition of anti-nuclear sentiment in Scotland, I find it quite hard to imagine that an independent Scotland wouldn't sign up to that treaty quite early. And if it does, then all these questions of, retaining Trident, it just goes out the window, because you would have to get rid of it.
Yeah, absolutely you would. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Okay, well, when we were sort of discussing this podcast in advance, you pointed me in the direction of the what was it, the demographics of independence document on the Commonweal website. So
That's right.
yeah, I've been having a bit of a difficult day with a Sainsbury's delivery that went disastrously wrong and took me about 3 hours to resolve. So as a result of that, I haven't read it as thoroughly as I was hoping to, but I do have some of it in front of me, and so we can talk about it a bit. I was interested in, there's one thing that caught my eye is it was written by Craig DL, who you mentioned earlier, and he's drawn a sort of profile of, I think it's four or five different profiles of people, you know, like target these typical target voters. So there's you know, the disaffected is one example. People who you know, just disaffected with everything. So they vote yes for independence because they're disaffected with the union, and then they vote leave in the EU referendum because they're disaffected with the EU, and so they're just sort of going against the status quo. But of course, I suppose once you vote leave, there's a kind of maybe a cognitive dissonance, and then trying to get independence, which might return Scotland to the European Union. So
Yes, that's something that they would want to avoid in many cases.
Yeah, and there's so there's the non-participants, disillusioned with politics and power. Just they feel very Scottish, never vote no, but they probably wouldn't vote at all. I think that's the argument. So you would with that sort of person, you would have to it was a question of whether they would abstain or whether you could somehow drag them to the polling station and get them to vote yes.
That's what sort of campaign you run, I suppose, but I think to identify that group is very important, because you know, at the hub, when we stick our wee card table outside and greet people as they go by, or in one of the street stalls, you will frequently find those people. They're just not into politics because, you know, bugger the lot of them, basically. And to be honest, the level at which political debate is carried out, and the levels of trust that we can have in our politicians, that's in both places to an extent. You can't in some ways blame them. You almost have to sort of coax them back to the process and say, no, this does matter and we can do something different. And that's a hard thing to do.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting document. I mean, there were one or two things about it that I would sort of slightly raise question marks about. Because it was quite a
This is one of the reasons I was slightly scared to bring it up, because I know you know your stuff.
There's quite a long section about why support for independence has fallen back this year, and there's like 6, 7, 8 possible explanations given for this. You know, obviously things like the Alex Salmond affair, and you know, declining popularity of Nicola Sturgeon, and the vaccine rollout, and lots of perfectly plausible reasons. There's also a very short section about why the independent support rose so much last year, and it just sort of says in passing that it didn't have anything to do with the pandemic. I thought that was quite odd, because, well, certainly it's the rise in support for independence last year coincided with a big rise in Nicola Sturgeon's personal ratings, because before the pandemic, Nicola Sturgeon's, people forget this now, but Nicola Sturgeon's personal ratings before the pandemic were not as good as they were, certainly, you know, when she first became First Minister. And there was a long spell, you know, when Ruth Davidson was still the Conservative leader, where, you know, Ruth Davidson was pretty much level with Nicola Sturgeon in personal ratings, or slightly ahead of her. And Nicola Sturgeon had become quite a polarizing figure, and, you know, certainly, you know, probably as much as maybe half the population had a bit of a problem with her. And, you know, she was a Marmite figure in the way that Alex Salmond used to be. And suddenly the pandemic comes along, and I can't see any other explanation for her sudden surge in personal popularity. And she was absolutely stratospheric personal ratings last year. That was clearly caused by the pandemic, and I find it almost inconceivable that was not linked to the unprecedented run of yes majorities last year running into the start of this year.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I think the report looking at the demographics of independence is looking at the polls that have been carried out. And of course, as you will know, with polls, it very much depends on the questions you're asked and how you're asked them. And it's sort of taking things in the round. I think it's much harder reading the report to come up with a clear idea of why things went as they went. Although I agree with you that almost certainly the perception of Nicola Sturgeon, particularly in the first 9 to 12 months of the pandemic, must have contributed to the rise in the idea that independence was a good idea. Because at that point, the UK government was not waving vaccines at us and saying, look at what we've done. That might be one of the reasons it's began to go the other way, even though that isn't justified. So I think more work needs to be done by the polling organisations, not Commonweal necessarily, to try and determine what it is that went right and what it is that's gone wrong since. Now, one organisation that is currently involved in that, as far as I know, is Believe in Scotland, Gordon McIntyre Kemp's outfit, who are about to run their day of action, which will run into an autumn of action, and they're bringing on board, they hope 100, I think they've currently got 86 yes groups, and they're going to push certain buttons, let's say. And their whole shtick is based on polling on various things. And I think that needs to be extended further to understand what it was that people did like in the early part of the pandemic, why it is that certain demographics have dropped away. For example, and the interesting thing that struck me about the report was that it's the native Scots voters. We've talked a lot about maybe reshrinking the franchise so that only people who are native Scots should vote. That's a highly controversial thing, and I do not support it. I have to say, I know it's a non-starter because having extended the franchise by law, now to shrink it introduces issues of human rights, and it introduces it destroys potentially international legitimacy. So yes, it's a non-starter. Whatever Professor Alf Baird may say, and I'm really sorry for those people that swear by the Professor Alf Baird, but the main point is that it shouldn't matter anyway, because English voters in Scotland, their support for independence appears to have started to rise in 2018 and kept rising. Non-English, non-Scottish, because they sort of lump all the non-English, non-Scots into other, which is like Ireland, Northern Ireland, Wales, EU and non-EU. Their support has gone up over the period by 17.9%. So, you know, those are sort of rising trends. We need to do more work in both areas. But the surprising thing is the native Scots where it's fallen back. Specifically, the youngest tranche of women voters between 15 and 34, where it's dropped by, I think, from memory, checks, notes, something like 14 to 17%, a fairly significant figure. And then men between 35 and 54. There's been a drop there of something like 12%. Now, why has that happened? And what's that related to? And it did begin, it seems, in 2020, after we had the run of 20 consecutive yes or just about yes polls. I suspect it may have to do with the pandemic, but we need to know. There isn't enough about why. There's the what, but not the why. That's really what leapt out at me from the report.
It was interesting you said that about younger women, because actually that was one of the, when I was sort of making a sort of putting one or two question marks beside it, that was one of the ones that I was slightly unsure. I mean, I'd have to see the figures, but I just wondered if there was really enough. I presume that must be coming from subsamples. It seemed to be talking about a decline in support among young women this year. So it would be based on polls this year. And I
So
just
the sample's big enough is really what you're
I mean,
thinking in
there's a
terms of.
limited number of polls in 2021. And, you know, subsamples for women between 1834 or whatever it is wouldn't be that large. And so even if you put all those polls together, I mean, I'm not totally convinced there'd be enough evidence to really reach that conclusion, particularly when we know that you know, support for independence among women generically is better than it was several years ago. So you know, I think until you see
from memory, the other age groups of women support has gone up, but yeah, it's a mystery.
Make it seem a bit odd, and possibly I would put a question mark and wonder whether that's really true, that there has been a greater drop among young women than among others.
Maybe we just need more polling to see if that's right, and if it's right, try and establish, you know, what's behind it.
In terms of last year, it seems to me that you know, just because of the circumstances of the pandemic, with it happening to touch on areas that are largely under the Scottish government's control, it seems to me that it was like the first time probably since the middle 18th century, since the Jacobite rebellion, that people have seen what it's like for Scotland to basically be governing itself on all the issues that actually matter. And I think that was the kind of the revelation for people. And you can see this in other countries where, you know, where at a sort of lower than national level, where the decisions were being made. So, you know, like in America, Andrew Cuomo became so important, and probably in Australia, the various state premiers, and probably the same in Canada. And in this country, obviously, decisions have been taken by Nicola Sturgeon and by Mark Drakeford, and in Northern Ireland by the
both enhanced their reputations. And you could see from people like George Fuchs trying to get these damn broadcasts stopped that it was worrying the opposition. It was worrying the unionist side of things that she was getting all that exposure.
Well, he got his way, didn't he? You know, he actually got the BBC. I mean, it's pointless.
He got this weird halfway house, didn't he? You know, first of all, you hear the first minister, you get a couple of questions, then you get Douglas Ross with the chicken noises.
What does it add to have Douglas Ross and Alex Cole? What does that add to anything?
The way BBC Scotland does things. Nobody else does this. It doesn't happen in Wales. I mean, Wales have got a respectable unionist government, but, you know, they do stand up for Wales, but that's all right because they're unionist at the end. And it's quite one of the plus points for our whole movement is that we still frighten them. We still frighten them when we do things right. So we should do things right a bit more.
Oh, that was really, you're drawing the parallel with Wales. That was reminding me of the leaders' debates when, you know, of course, you know, obviously, I don't know how you feel about the Alba party, but those of us,
I'll tell you in a minute if you like.
Those of us who support the Alba party were sort of frustrated about the complete lack of representation in the TV debates. And so I watched the Welsh debate that night. I decided to watch the Welsh debate, and suddenly on comes, as a full participant in the debate, they abolished the Welsh Assembly Party, and then there was a further debate with UKIP, and with immediately after with UKIP and the Greens, and it was like people were joking with the Monster Raving Loony Party about to come on. It was such a wonderfully inclusive evening of political debate, but BBC Scotland and STV are incapable of replicating that.
Well, absolutely. I mean, as far as the Alba party is concerned, there's no reason to exclude any party that looks capable of getting support, or even parties that don't look capable of getting support, including the Monster Raving Loony. There's no reason to exclude anybody from the debates, except your choice to do so. I suspect that when Alba was founded, they did not expect it quite to get the media blackout that it did.
Yeah.
But where we are now with it, I know a lot of people who've gone over to Alba or have Alba sympathies. Some people clinging on to the SNP still by their fingertips. Mm-hmm. We all do manage to chat. One of the good things about having the hub back is you can actually talk to people in person who have these views and have slightly extended conversations with them. So I think for the Alba party, there's still a possible future there. They have to find a way to operate in the circumstances they've got and be a positive voice for independence and move themselves forward as a party. So I will be looking with interest at the upcoming conference to see what they can do about that. I do know a lot of the people who went over to the Alba party that I know are good people.
Yeah.
They're competent people, they're capable people, and they're sincere people, and they're not interested in just looking at somebody's ego trip, and they're not interested in trying to pockle things. What they want to do is get independence and do it right. And I utterly respect that. I'm not a supporter of Alba, but you know, it's interesting that they're here, and I wish them well in finding their space in the spectrum and what they can contribute to things going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a member of Alba, so I was watching the hustings for the various office bearer positions, and I was really struck by the quality of that debate. You know, they are serious people. They are, you know, credible people who you could easily imagine as SNP parliamentarians if they had, you know, stuck with the SNP. You know, that they're of that sort of caliber, and probably in some cases, without sort of doing anybody down, they're probably in some cases they are superior to some, you know, minority perhaps of the current SNP parliamentarians.
Well, SNP lost some of their number one list candidates, particularly around my neck of the woods and in other places, I think, as well, to the Alba party.
Oh yeah, sure, yeah. How did you feel incidentally about the you know, the protected, I can't remember, what was it, the reserve places scheme for the SNP, where, you know, people with I think half the regions were set aside for people with disabilities, although disabilities was very broadly defined, and that was one of the controversial points. You know, it's like people were talking about maybe possibly even dyslexia, which, you know, seems to kind of trivialize. You know, if you're going to sort of reserve places for disabled people, you think you'd want to take it a bit more seriously than that. And
I think it's I don't think it's, I think it was done with honest intentions. I think the way they did it possibly was a bit arbitrary, because depending on what region you were in, it was either your race or your disability that counted, as I recall, and that seemed to me to be purely arbitrary. I also think, yes, it gets difficult when you start getting into definitions of disability and what counts and what doesn't, and that can get a wee bit uncomfortable. I would prefer a system where people in minorities have enough help at ground level naturally to rise to the position where they're as likely to be selected as candidates as anybody else. I acknowledge that in the early stages of that, you need to be a bit more explicit about it. But I think they meant it honestly. Maybe it didn't quite work out right for them. In the end, it didn't matter, because how many list MPs were elected? 2, 3? Can't remember exactly.
The two that were elected, how many were elected? I hope I'm not going to show myself up. But anyway, Emma Harper was, there were 2 in the South. Oh gosh, this is terrible.
You're right, there were. Yes, well, you know, yeah, they did better in the South. Yeah. But
Emma Roddick was elected. One thing, I mean, you know, I'm probably not on the same side of the fence as Emma Roddick on a lot of issues, but I'm really uncomfortable with the way people are attacking her for having borderline personality disorder. I don't think she should be in the Parliament simply because she has BPD, but the way people are reacting to, you know, it's certain. It is quite.
I completely agree with that. I completely agree with that, and I think the way in which all of us have conducted ourselves in terms of reacting to people who are not just different, the way we react to each other as human beings is not great at the moment. It really is not. And that's one of the things that absolutely needs to improve, for the very good reason that it will help us to work together for what we all actually want. I suspect it will also actually make us better people, but morally it's the right way to be. I've been disappointed by some of the public discourse we've seen. And I say that as somebody who's write a blog slanging people off the whole time. But, you know, there are ways to do it, and there's reasonably respectful ways to do it. And it's not always been evident in what we've seen.
Well, we're coming to the end, so maybe I'll go back to the question you sort of suggested I should ask, which was, in what circumstances do you think you would go back to writing your very popular blog?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I have some family stuff I'm doing at the minute, which is taking up a lot of my time. That will disappear towards the end of the year, I very much hope. People at the Yes Hub in Perth keep telling me that I should delegate more. So I would hope to do that. And if I can do that, and I've also very slightly stepped down from Yes Perth City, which, I mean, the Yes movement in Perth is functioning through the hub principally at the moment. And there's a big crossover in terms of personnel between that and Yes Perth City. So I can afford to step back from Yes Perth City for a bit. All of these are just flimsy excuses for not doing it yet. But I do hope that it might be possible, but I'm not. Going to put a date on it. There you go. That's just like the referendum now.
Well, people will be breathless of the excitement waiting to.
Oh, Lord.
Moment.
It'll be disappointing. Well, I'll probably have forgotten how to write by the time I get back.
I'm sure it will not be disappointing. Whatever else it will be, it will not be disappointing. So thanks very much, William. It's been really interesting to hear your views, and I really appreciate your time today.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So that was episode 12 of the podcast, and hopefully I'll be back with another episode before too long. In the meantime, keep checking the Scot Goes Pop blog for all the latest polling news and political commentary. Bye for now.